Hello and welcome back to Real Estate Live and our second week of virtual events brought to you by White Label and our partners. We've been really delighted with the number of attendees we've had tuning into our sessions this week and the levels of audience participation. And we're looking to hear from you, the audience, as much as possible during each of our panels. So to kick that off, we're about to launch a polling question asking what is the most important factor in unlocking development and ensuring the continued strength of UK real estate. We asked the same question back in our panels in June, and we'll be sharing the results and the comparisons with the answers then and now at the end of the week. So I'll give you a few minutes to vote and think about your answers. There's a few different options up on the screen, and then we'll share the answers with you in the future, so look out for those. During the session, please continue to interact with us using Zoom's Q&A feature to put questions to our speakers. As chair of this panel, I'm particularly keen that you talk to us and put forward the questions that you'd like answered, and we'll look to come to as many of them as possible during the hour that we have to have this discussion. After we've had some introductory remarks from our speakers, and I've started a sort of debate between some initial questions. So we've got some really great speakers joining us for this session. I think we've got a great range of views and looking forward to hearing what our panel have to say. I think it's a really interesting time to be talking about the industrial and logistics sector. Obviously, it has been seeing a significant rise even in 2019, despite Brexit uncertainties and everything else that was happening then. And based on the research I've been having a look at for this year, I think rates of occupation have actually risen above the highest pre-recorded take-up, which was last year, even within the first 3 quarters of this year. So yeah, it's been a really exceptional time for the sector and interesting to see how it might grow further in the southwest of London. So this panel is being supported by Aviva Investors, Barwell Business Park and Merton Industrial Park, and yeah, we hope you enjoy the session. So I guess to kickstart the debate, as our host for the session today, I'm going to come to Colin Lawrence Waterhouse from Aviva Investors to give us an introduction to Aviva's assets in southwest London, tell us a bit about the business parks that they have there, how they fared this year, and their continuing enthusiasm for the southwest of London. So over to Colin.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'm Colin Lawrence Waterhouse from Aviva Investors. I'm the asset manager responsible for the southwest London industrial assets. Southwest London has been a core investment focus for Aviva for excess of 25 years, and over that time, we've built a very strong cluster of industrial facilities, ranging from small-scale startup units all the way to large-scale multi-let, last-mile logistics and distribution centre space. I think there are a number of reasons why we're such strong investors in southwest London. Part of that for us is certainly the excellent transport links and connections, certainly the high quality of life as well. Aviva Investors as a mantra like to invest in locations where people like to live, work and play, and certainly I think southwest London ticks all those boxes from a quality of life perspective, balanced with obviously the right employment opportunities as well. From a talent pool perspective, southwest London is obviously very fortunate as well to have a large, skilled and highly educated workforce. That certainly is a major draw for a lot of the occupiers that ultimately will locate in the area. And I think similarly, we also are driven somewhat by the fact that there are relatively high barriers of entry. There are limited land supplies in southwest London. That does mean that demand is kept relatively high for existing industrial stock. And that, from an investment standpoint, always ensures that we're able to generate good returns from our real estate. In terms of our key holdings, we have 2 major industrial estates in southwest London. One being Merton Industrial Park, which forms part of a 500,000 square foot cluster located in Merton, distributed across not just Merton Industrial Park but also Nelson Trade Park and South Wimbledon Trade Park as well. That's very much a part focused on trade counter food production to a certain extent as well, and also last mile logistics. And in the last 12 months, we've been very pleased to announce the letting of 32,000 square foot to Ocado, a last mile logistics hub. Interesting unit, and actually a change of use from that building's previous use as a out of town retail warehouse to home base. Our second major asset is Barwell Business Park over in Chessington. That's a 400,000 square foot multi-let estate with a very diverse tenant mix ranging from SME businesses all the way through to major global corporates such as Callaway Golf, Sega Amusements, etc. So yeah, I mean, we have a very strong base in Southwest London, and we're always looking to grow it, whether that's through procurement of further standing stock investments or looking at development land that we can bring forward ourselves. So certainly from our perspective, it's a core focus of our investment strategy going forward, and hopefully we'll be able to grow our holding.
Definitely, really interested to hear how long you've been having an asset base in that area and over the 25-year period. And I guess the high quality of life piece is really important for Southwest London. Do you think that's one of the things that's helped you attract so many occupiers over that time? Has that been a key part of that journey, or are there other factors that have also been really useful in filling your industrial units?
No, absolutely. I think the high quality of life is a major factor. I think, you know, it's interesting coming through the back of COVID-19. I think everyone's mindset on work-life balance has changed, but you know, I think it simply emphasised the need for people to have that right balance between their work life and their personal life. So living in an area where actually there are strong employment opportunities, where they don't have to commute for large distances, I think is certainly more important now than it ever has been. But I think certainly has been a major driver as to why Southwest London's flourished as it has. I mean, you know, you only need to take a half a day tour around Southwest London and visit centres such as Kingston and even areas like Croydon, which have seen so much new investment over the last 5 to 10 years. And actually, all of these locations are really changing and providing a very high quality of life for their residents.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure that's something we'll be talking more about during this panel. It's interesting to hear that as a selling point for industrial logistics. Obviously, we've been talking about that a lot in office conversations about the work-life balance, but I guess the out-of-town nature of industrial and logistics sector could be quite a selling point for future jobs in terms of being a bit further out of London and having a bit more open space around them potentially. So interesting points. I'm going to also bring in Ollie now. Ollie's Vice President of Leasing and Development at Prologis. And I was wondering, Ollie, if you could tell us a bit, obviously for some of the audience who may not know that much about Prologis, tell us a bit about the company, your point of view on the industrial and logistics market UK-wide, I guess, because I know you've got a very strong footprint in lots of different areas. And I guess some of your views about how that's changed over the past 9 months, demand, where it's coming from, how it's grown potentially.
Yeah, sure. So just to start with a little bit about Prologis. I think that the headline is, you know, we're the largest owner and developer of industrial real estate globally. The business has $100 billion of assets under management, and that is all industrial and logistics. We're a US REIT traded on the New York Stock Exchange, so, you know, long-term investors. And, you know, it's a sort of truly global portfolio. We are, you know, have operations in the US, Europe, China, South America, and really, I think if you wanted to sort of a good idea of what our investment strategy looks like, if you looked at the flows of global trade from production into ports, then from ports inland through, you know, rail and road networks, and then to the final point of consumption in cities, you know, our sort of real estate footprint very closely follows those flows. And to give an example of that, something like 2% of global GDP flows through Prologis buildings every year. Within the UK, we've been operating for 20 years. We have, you know, over £4 billion worth of assets under management. I think we were traditionally perhaps best known for our Midlands sort of big box activity. But that has really sort of started to change, and there's been a big focus from the business on investing in London, which we have always done. But I think there is a view much more now that we would like to get greater exposure to the London market. And then to pick up your question just on changes that we've seen, since COVID, I think as you picked up there, really, overall the picture has been overwhelmingly positive. A lot of the processes that we saw prior to COVID have really accelerated. I think the most notable one there is in terms of e-commerce. If you look at the sort of grocery stats, something like 18% of total spend was online pre-COVID, and that's moved up to sort of 28%, and I think possibly even north of 30% now. And I think a lot of that we see is permanent change. People aren't necessarily going to go back. I think there's certain demographics that were perhaps resistant to online shopping that have been forced into it, but now can probably really see the benefits and the convenience of it. And to put that into context, it took us 10 years to get from 8% to 18%. So we've seen what was the equivalent of the last 10 years growth in 9 months, which is really quite significant, quite profound changes. And there's some other things going on as well around resilience of supply chains, people wanting to hold more stock, concerns over a reliance of very complex global networks and people wanting to take greater control of that and bring processes closer to the UK and closer to home. And as you say, we've seen record take up already this year. So 2020 we'll see the highest take up of any year, and we're already only in Q3, so we've got another quarter. I think the only perhaps bit that I would caveat all that positivity is it is a mixed picture. There are people in our portfolio and the market generally that are still suffering. We have a lot of traditional retailers. Some have been able to pivot and move online better than others. And so, that there will be issues and further sort of insolvency within our portfolio. Also within a London context, we have all those people that sort of serve central London food production, that serve that whole economy of people travelling into London and eating and drinking. And we have a number of occupiers in that respect that are also finding times really tough.
Yeah, that's sad too. I guess, it is a very optimistic picture for this sector more broadly, but definitely good to remember some of the places that it may not be as straightforward for at the moment. And maybe talk about the potential future growth for them and what may change about their operations over the next few years. So interesting points. I guess quickly before I move on to the next speaker, you said you've got a focus on London. Have you got any particular focus areas in London? Are you looking at the southwest in particular, or have you got abroad anywhere in London that you're interested in finding some new things?
It's not everywhere in London. We do have our preferred sort of investment characteristics, and southwest London is very much an investment area for us. I've indulged in a bit of self-promotion, and I've got Prologis Park Bennington in the background where we're building out a new scheme there, and we've just bought another site opposite, which will be an expansion in the phase 2 of that park. We've recently acquired in Weybridge in Chessington as well, but we really have no ceiling on the amount of capital that we do want to deploy. I think as Colin quite nicely articulated, Southwest London does have very constrained supply with high barriers to entry. It also has a large population with some affluent pockets. So from an e-commerce perspective, if you overlay those characteristics, it's really positive. I always have to say, that's good for us landlords in terms of the prospects for future rental growth, and you've seen some huge rental increases in this part of the world. But in terms of the interests, talking perhaps to the policy makers and people who make provision for industrial land, obviously it is a squeeze on the occupiers, and really there is not enough stock, not enough industrial space for occupiers, and so really we would all like to see more industrial land allocated and more support in bringing sites forward, because the demand is there.
I guess we can bring that to the policymakers in just a second, and also it'd be good to pick up after we've talked to some of the speakers about some of the other investment characteristics you mentioned. Obviously you talked about Southwest London being green and affluent and having a high population, but maybe picking up on some of the other factors that might be influencing investment decisions. So that would be good. But before we do, I'm going to bring in Robert Bradley Smith, who's the Vice President of Agency at Altus. Obviously works quite closely in this sector and with some of the other people on our call. So Rob, I was hoping you could tell us a bit about the industrial logistics market again, that you've seen from an agent's point of view, what occupiers are looking for at the moment, and sort of your predictions for future tenants, future growth in the sector. So over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Just picking up, I'm the sort of letting director across the Aviva Southwest London portfolio, so have had a very hands-on relationship with Colin in respect of Merton and Barwell over the last 18 months, and we've seen, I'll pick up on some of the successes there, but generally, Ollie mentioned the drive of retail. I picked up a stat this week on internet sales, and January 2016 internet sales in the UK were about £800 million. In August 2019 that rose to £1.33 billion, and in the space of 11 months, so COVID, how have we gone? June 2020, as a UK population, we were spending £2.24 billion online.
Wow.
They're big numbers, but that is where the industrial and the logistics sector has been driven. Twofold, we're seeing the e-tailers, as Ollie has mentioned, and we're also seeing the third-party logistics carriers. So that's the likes of UPS, DHL, FedEx taking space. Back to the retailers, and I think you mentioned in your opening gambit, Bonnie, take up in the logistics sector better than last year. Ollie mentioned the first 9 months of this year. Another stat out from the big West End firms this week is we will have seen the best take-up of logistics, industrial warehouse space in 8 out of the last 10 years. So that is more space. Combination of that, COVID, I think, has accelerated this drive to the online sector. That, I think, was already happening anyway, and Prologis' stats have backed that up in terms of where we've gone. It's just the changing population and where we're at. We're also seeing a change within the online sector. So the likes of Ocado going for a faster delivery. We book at 8 o'clock in the morning, we get it delivered by 11 o'clock the same day. They're still also running, as we've secured a letting at Merton, Ocado are running delivery time, so you book it on a Thursday and you get it within the week. So they're now looking at is that faster delivery time that we want as a population. In the southwest area and at Barwell, we've actually seen the medical sector, and not driven by COVID. We've just let 40,000 square foot there to Steris, which is for them to facilitate instrument sterilisation for a lot of the hospitals. So Epsom, St George's, all within the sort of southwest London area. So benefit for them, benefit for us. They looked at Croydon but ended up plumping for us down at Barwell for the building. We've also seen Wheel Freedom, who are a wheelchair specialist provider, coming. So the sectors, certainly medical has seen that. As I mentioned, online retailers, e-tailers. Where do I see the future? It's always the crystal ball. Thank you for that one. I'm hoping that I think e-tail will continue. The third-party logistics will continue as fast as we buy. We also send stuff back. You can't hand it over to the returns counter. So that will be another sector that I suspect will come on through. I think the high streets, and not my specialist, but I suspect they will change and evolve. And probably on that point, I think hearing from Duncan and Chris will be interesting to hear how the local authorities will see that and face up to that factor, Bonnie.
Yeah, definitely. Really interested to hear about some of the different sectors that are growing and developing. I mean, you can definitely see the e-commerce rising. I can see it every day when parcels come down to my door. So yeah, it's definitely been a huge change in that. But interesting to hear about some of the other sectors that don't sound like they're particularly COVID driven, or they're just like the medical sector that's been expanding. And Barwell, can you see any reason that they chose Barwell in particular? What were the things that drove them there? Their expansion, was that just demand driven, or what's been?
I think one of the reasons for the take up of space was probably a lack of speculative development. As Ollie's, he's probably got one of the few schemes, speculative schemes in our area that has got steelwork going up in Croydon. So we had a building of 40,000 square foot that ticked a box. As we've said, that the parameters of property don't really change. It is location, 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 ultimately. And Steris at Barwell have the ability to use the train line for getting people in and out of work. There's also access down to the motorway. Again, just those crucial communication factors that the park offers.
Definitely. Interesting to think about what we could do to encourage more speculative development, or make it possible. I guess if Ollie's saying that there's no roof on the spending for Prologis, then there is appetite to do it. So just interesting to find out how we can facilitate that. So I guess coming on to Chris then next. Chris Lee is the Director for Environment and Regeneration at Merton Council. And Chris, I was just hoping, I guess from a more like place and holistic view, if you could tell us a bit about the industrial and logistics sector in Merton, how important it is to the borough, and how it sort of fits into the wider borough's regeneration plans. So.
Thanks, Bonnie. I suppose to kick off with that first point, this sector is very, very important to us. I mean, our politicians desire to have sustainable communities, and that means local employment, local good quality housing, and all of the infrastructure in between. And we believe we've got a very good start there in southwest London, and Colin touched upon some of the benefits of this particular region. But we have 3 strategic industrial estates in the borough, and we guard them very carefully because they do generate a significant amount of local employment, and they are changing over time. And I'll go on to talk about our future aspirations in a moment. We know that they're in high demand. We know that they deliver yields, and that's because of the proximity to good quality employees with high qualifications and good local transport. And also, as the centre of gravity is moving in London and outer London is becoming more important, they do offer the quality of life and the access to parks and all of those other benefits that we enjoy. We have seen that they have evolved and changed, and they'll continue to evolve and change over time. And we work very carefully with the business improvement districts on 2 of our industrial estates. We've got a 3rd in Wimbledon town centre, and Robert touched upon the future changes in the high street, which we're seeing. But we, as a local authority, continue to work closely with the business improvement districts in order to see how they can adapt and change going forward. And they've done that successfully. For example, one of the areas we've supported one of our industrial estates around Wimbledon was around the installation of superfast broadband, which was beyond their reach, and we were able to access a government scheme in order to support that infrastructure going in. Looking forward, it won't surprise anybody that we are under enormous pressure to drive forward the zero carbon agenda, both locally in the sub-region as a borough and London in terms of the mayor's priorities. And so we see the industrial estates continuing to adapt and be flexible and delivering some of those green jobs. The mayor's got an ambition to double the green economy in London by 2030, and we see these estates as being part of that ambition. And I'm keen to hear from the sector as to what we can do to help support that. The logistics sector is part of that future, I suspect, but there are a whole range of uses that we could be looking at for these estates in the future to help with that transition. One area that I'm also interested in is housing. The demand for housing and the target we're being set in the locality in Merton has gone up from 450 a year to over 1,000. How are we going to meet that with the pressure on land in the borough? How do we balance that? If we want to have mixed use estates, how do we balance that alongside a logistics sector that's probably operating 24/7? That's a big challenge for us, and I'm interested to hear how we can work with the sector to meet our housing targets whilst also increasing job density and the greening, the sort of carbon zero targets that we want to deliver. Thanks, Bonnie.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely come back to put both those questions to Colin and to Ollie about things that the boroughs could do to help with the transition to a more green and sustainable future, and the balance between housing and industrial, which is obviously a bit of a trade-off in terms of land, but also in terms of the way that residents interact with the places. And I think also the point about the boroughs, the bids, sorry, and how they can help make the business communities in industrial parks a bit more of a community, initiatives that they can do to make it, I don't know, a bit more of an attractive destination to work, that sort of thing would be good to talk about, because I know that Ollie's definitely got some views about the perceptions of the industry and how they've changed over time and what more we can do. So yeah, lots of good things to pick up on. But before I come to all of those very interesting questions, I do want to come to Duncan next, who's the Assistant Director of Regeneration and Strategic Housing at the Royal Borough of Kingston. So Duncan, I guess building on what Chris has said, it'd be good just to have an introduction to Kingston, its major business strengths for the audience. I mean, we could have people tuning in who may or may not know a lot about the borough, so a bit of an introduction to that, and then your views on whether you welcome more industrial development and what the challenges, competing priorities might be that you have to consider in bringing it forward.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I echo very much what Chris says about the place of South West London. If people don't know Kingston, it's the second smallest borough in Greater London, but it also is quite a dense borough with some wonderful spaces by the river and some strong town centres. Our population is quite affluent, actually. We have pockets of deprivation, but as some of the speakers have mentioned, we have a highly skilled population, but very much a commuter-in population. So that sort of daily brain drain we have of highly skilled people traditionally pre-COVID into the city, we now host that community throughout the day. And one of our sort of strategies really is to look at how we capture that going forward. We also have an in-commuter employment base who come in to do a lot of the retail jobs and other jobs, so a lower skill base. So I think it's really encouraging that we continue to have the assets of the Barwell Business Park and other business parks. I think Barwell's probably our sort of top performer in that respect, and that's really good, and we will want to encourage that going forward and start to create policies that really continue to encourage that. But we'll need to look at our existing assets where we do have the industrial parks that are probably lower grade, and that's an investment opportunity, and that's a growth area for us. So yeah, at the moment it's a very challenging environment, as Chris says. We've got a rise in unemployment. We need to find new jobs for our residents. We've got a new cohort of unemployed. We've got 24,000 people of our workforce, which makes up about a third of our workforce on furlough, and that obviously is coming to an end soon, or there'll be other schemes, but there will be a big sort of demand for new employment in a borough. And where better can we look is target those sectors that have been mentioned around, particularly care and logistics. So I think there's some really interesting work the borough and the public sector can do, working in partnership with the private sector. And Kingston's already set up a economic recovery task force, which is chaired by the leader, and Aviva are one of our constituent partners, but we have a range of big employers. And really, for me, it's having those on the panel from larger business who are seeming to be succeeding at the moment. We also have Unilever on there, who've just made their global investment into the borough, so a real shot of confidence to harness that energy and that success and begin to share that with our residents and all the supply chains that come off that as well. So but we also have Kingston University, we have GLA, we have a number of institutional players, if you like, and we're joining in a sort of recovery mission really to kickstart the economy ahead of sort of what we're seeing as this cliff edge that's arriving around unemployment of our residents. So we're really readjusting very quickly at the moment. But going back to the industrial sector, it's certainly an area of growth we want to encourage. We know that our assets, our strategic road network, the airport proximity, the good schools. Kingston has some of the best secondary schools in the country. We already, I think, have sustainable neighbourhoods. We have that inherent conflict between cars and being sustainable as well, and that's something we'll have to consider going forward, working with our industrial parks. So, the CEO of Unilever even said, when we asked him the question, why Kingston, and it was all those reasons. So it's very real when these investments are made. So we're proud of that, but we, as a region, working with our colleagues at Merton and other boroughs, we really need to enhance that going forward, because we are in competition with the rest of London, the rest of the UK and the rest of the world. So we need to make this place as attractive as possible to be prosperous.
Yeah, definitely good to hear that it's a growth area, I guess, in terms of this panel. But interesting to hear the things about jobs being brought up again, the future jobs, and potentially looking to reskill or redeploy talent within the borough to some of these sectors and some of these companies. I guess it'd be good to have a conversation about that, about the perception of jobs within the industrial sector, the how many people that they can employ, trying to, dispel some of the myths that I'm sure I've often heard about there being a view that the industrial sector employs sort of more low-level jobs, but actually that's not quite true. So I don't know if Colin and or Ollie might like to make some comments about some of the employment opportunities that the parks that you manage can bring to local areas.
Yeah, I think just to kick off then, I certainly think over the last few years, certainly when you look at Merton and Barwell, the types of employer that we've seen come onto the park have certainly changed, and the sector that those businesses operate in, we've certainly seen a bigger shift towards what I'd probably class as more high-tech and research and development type users, and even in the logistics sector, and Ollie's got more experience of this than me, but certainly when you start to look at the likes of Amazon and Ocado and the models that they're operating in their facilities now, the level of automation is so high that actually the specialist, almost engineering and IT side of their staff that they need to fulfill is now a major part of their workforce. So I think, in terms of what jobs are now available in the industrial sector, it has absolutely changed. But similarly, I think, occupiers are now looking at the industrial sector, not even all the time because they necessarily want an industrial building. I mean, we've got occupiers at units at Barwell, which are what we class as hybrid units, so 50% offices, 50% warehousing. And actually, we're seeing straight office occupiers take that space from us, in part to convert part of the ground floor to create additional office accommodation, but also because it does enable them to potentially bring functions such as archive, storage, etc., away from external facilities and bring it back in-house again. So I think, it isn't a traditional, there isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all industrial occupier these days. I think as a sector, it's probably seen the greatest shift in terms of diversification of businesses that are taking space.
Definitely. And Ollie, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I fully endorse all the comments that Colin has made there. And, I was thinking in this debate as well, it's important to remember that, society needs a range of jobs, and particularly, Duncan mentioned the prior barriers, sometimes, the idea of a warehouse operative is also slightly, kind of diminished, but we do need jobs that have low barriers to entry. And, when you look in the logistics sector, you'll find probably more than many other places where you'll find someone that's come into a job at 16 and has worked their way through the system and have, made successful careers of themselves. And, logistics plays a really important function in that. And perhaps, at this time where we've got hospitality sectors and the like, and people becoming unemployed, there are opportunities within the logistics sector. Indeed, it's been a big problem for our customers and occupiers to find enough staff. So, you know, I think there's definitely an opportunity there for our sector to play a role going forward.
Definitely. And in terms of attracting talent, no, Rob, you'd mentioned that the sort of talent pool around the industrial parks in South West London was strong. Is that one of the major pools that's been bringing occupiers in? And yeah, has that been? Is there enough talent in the area? What can the boroughs do?
I think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is. I think you've also got these Prologis have run a study. I mentioned it to Ollie earlier today, but have for every 5 years interviewed their portfolio of tenants, and we have seen since 90, I think it was 91, the first report came out by Cranfield Institute, and it was 50% of the jobs are in the warehouse, 50% were in sort of the slightly lower level delivery jobs. That has now changed. We are now at something like 30% degree educated people working within the logistics sector, as Colin and Ollie have both said. And I think that is one of the benefits of the South West London area, skilled, educated population. But it's across the board. We need to work with the local authorities to be able to deliver these facilities from both points of view. We need to offer the housing for these people, but these are the next generation are the guys that are shopping online. It's the norm. They want it delivered in the next couple of hours. With automation comes a need for engineers, IT, marketing. It's all run out of the same building. So
yeah. And I guess from the other point of view, the other side of it is the attracting talent to come and work at an industrial logistics space. There's been some traditionally potentially negative perceptions of coming to work on an industrial park, thinking that it's not as fancy and glamorous as going into a central London office and that sort of thing. I know, Chris, you mentioned about the bids that you've got in Merton. Have they been doing any initiatives to try and change that perception? I know, Ollie, you've also mentioned before about perception of industrial as a sector, so perhaps you could come in after that.
Yeah, so local employment is very important, and working with the South Wimbledon Business Improvement District and Ocado, we managed to support Ocado in a demand-led programme of accessing local employees so that they weren't going far and wide. And that's one of the benefits of the South Wimbledon location, that it does sit very close to residential and very good transport. And we also worked very closely with the South Wimbledon Business Estate around improving the transport infrastructure, cycle lanes, and the look and feel of the estate. And we're talking to them and working with them now around tree planting, because the historical legacy of some of these sites is often banging and clanging, and the sort of construction side of the uses. They have adapted and flexed incredibly well, but we need to reflect that in the sort of infrastructure you would expect to see in these locations now. And thankfully that relationship is very strong and effective in doing that. And going forward, hopefully we'll work it further, more closely with them around developing the green jobs and the sort of infrastructure that we'll want to see there.
Yeah, I know, Colin, obviously that's one of the things at Barwell that's been made it easier to attract people there, having a bit more of a palatial feel, sort of a community atmosphere, lots of amenities on site, that sort of thing. Do you think that is true? And also, is there more that the boroughs and the local area sort of policymakers could do to help encourage more people to work at these places, or encourage their development as well? I guess going back to Chris's point earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people certainly want to feel happy where they're working these days. Placemaking is a big thing, and certainly when this might be something that Ollie can pick up on as well. But certainly, you look at any new build logistics development these days, and placemaking is a big part of that. Whether that's creation of some amenity on the actual park, or even things like ensuring there are perhaps running paths or external fitness areas, or even just external seating areas. I think that the way we design our industrial estates now is very different to how it was 20, 25 years ago, and it's probably a bit more of a challenge for us with the likes of Barwell to almost bring it into the present day to a certain extent, because obviously we're working with a design and a configuration of site which was acceptable 25, 30 plus years ago. But I think we were very lucky with Barwell because it was a landscaped, I always call it an industrial business park environment. It isn't a conventional industrial estate and certainly doesn't feel like it. So you're absolutely right, Bonnie. I mean, we've looked at improving the cafe amenity on the park, and we've brought in family-run business Coughlan's to operate a bakery cafe for us. Similarly, we've looked at even things like the quality of the refurbishments on the units to ensure that we're actually creating nice places to work. Provision of external seating areas, and our current program that we're working on is provision of EV charging points and improving the cycle storage facilities on the park as well. So I think we are trying to evolve all these parks, and any investor, any developer, any landlord needs to really look at how their assets are going to evolve to keep them current, and that's certainly going to be what we'll be doing for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Very exciting. Ollie, is that something that you are trying to replicate in your new build developments, the sort of placemaking that Colin mentioned and the palatial builds?
Yeah, exactly, Bonnie. And it is more difficult and more challenging in what we call sort of infill sites. Beddington is 10 acres, which, some of the stuff we do in the Midlands might be 200 or 300 acres, and you can master plan in there to have green spaces and amenities. And that's certainly the way we're going, as well as improvements within the buildings to make them better environments to work. But within the sort of within the London context, where you've got more fragmented ownerships, smaller ownerships, then there is the need for probably greater coordination at a policy level, and it is difficult, and it takes sort of long-term planning. I think the only thing that I'd perhaps just say counter to that is we also do have to remember that industrial buildings are essentially very functional buildings, and there are constraints within that. That they are big buildings. They do require large areas of yards for circulation, and so there probably have been some policies where perhaps some of that is not fully understood. And if you don't have a functional building and you can't lease it and you can't create jobs, that's not good for anyone. So it's really a case, I think, for us, to work with the public sector to better understand what are the needs of the sector, and how it's in all our interest that there is better quality environments delivered for a whole host of reasons. But we obviously still balancing that with the operational needs of operators as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Duncan, in Kingston, do you think that's something that members and I guess officers as well, is there a focus on the industrial sector? Do you think there's any sort of perception like difficulties or things that might need to be reimagined in terms of how people view these sorts of developments? If they were going to be coming forward, would there be opposition? Would there be questions about the landscaping or the yard space or the amount of space they're going to take up? I think it's a difficult area, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite a mixed picture, if I'm honest. But I think I suppose it might be controversial to say that we've maybe undervalued the sector in the last few years, taken it for granted. Mainly because it's been there, it's succeeding. I think where we're looking how, so we have a program of investment in our cycle lanes, for example, and we've been trying to connect all our neighbourhoods under a program so people can arrive sustainably at the industrial parks, and we have plans for investment in the public realm. But I think where we see a threat, I suppose, is places like the Kingston Road corridor, where it's not necessarily entirely designated as industrial, where it was big box retail, for example, and suddenly that's been snapped up by a residential developer, which isn't necessarily a problem, but what it does is start to take away that possible supply, because once it's lost to residential, it's basically lost forever. So we've currently got a study going on with the GLA at the moment about trying to evaluate these parcels of land before they come forward, around how we can better plan for them. And maybe it's about mixing in residential but not losing that vital commercial space, where we can promote industrial and logistics in a softer way. But I think the Kingston communities, I suppose, they're quite separated, I think, from some of our industrial parks, or they're surrounded by rivers or things like that, so they are traditionally cut off. But the integration point is an interesting one, because I think they do need to be better integrated, not least for the employees of those who work on it, but also the residents who who is sort of an ever increasing density in our neighbourhoods, they need further spaces to explore and enjoy. And I think industrial parks provide that opportunity. There's more of an opportunity for interaction now, I think, which, as some of the panelists have said, industrial parks have changed, they've modernised, they now have amenities. They never used to have that. They now have pavements, would you believe? Where previously, if you tried to walk into one, you'd get run over by an HGV. So that is improving. But I think for me, it's about integrating the communities. I don't sense there's a opposition to them. In fact, if we close down some of them, I think they'll probably be marching on the town hall, because I think a lot of people use them for for convenience as well. So that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely good to hear. And I know there's some sort of controversy about the integration point, but I guess parks like Barwell are sort of starting that journey, because they are that hybrid between office and industrial, and they do have the on-site amenities, and it does make it more of an accessible place for residential population to spend time and enjoy themselves in. I guess also the thing about integration brings us back to the green agenda point that Chris raised. I know Chris had said, what can the boroughs do to help promote the green agenda and support people like Aviva and Prologis in bringing forward developments and improving the net zero qualities of their parks. So I don't know if Colin or Ollie, you had any thoughts on whether there's any policy interventions that could help with that agenda, and I guess saying a bit about the net zero opportunities in the industrial sector already, and what you might be doing on your parks to encourage that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think firstly on the policy point from my side, I think that there's already been a slight transition shift to a more probably protectionist view of our industrial areas, and I think that's rightly so. We don't need to go back too many years to see that the situation that Duncan was referring to in Kingston of potential industrial land effectively being brought forward for residential. That was a big factor for the industrial sector, and a reason why we ended up losing a lot of reasonable quality in industrial stock. So I think certainly protecting what we've got is a good starting point, but the next part to the equation is then trying to create more. And I think there's various ways of doing that, and certainly as we did with the Ocado building at Merton, repurposing defunct retail warehouse space is certainly one route forward. Similarly, intensification of the industrial stock we've got can be another way that we go. But there will always need to be some additional industrial land that's created somewhere. So I think we do have to have a slightly open mind when it comes to release of strategic greenbelt land. I think similarly we have to have a very hard look at brownfield land, existing old, in some cases quite dilapidated industrial stock, and how that's either repurposed or redeveloped. And I think generally we have to all work together. I don't think there's necessarily a lot that the local authorities can do without public sector input and private sector input. And similarly, I don't think there's a lot that we can do without working in collaboration with the local authorities. So I think it is a joint approach, and it certainly needs to be going forward.
Yeah, definitely. And Ollie, your thoughts on that?
I think I wanted to say a few comments, perhaps just around perceptions and helping the messaging of our sector, both general public and the politicians that help to make decisions at planning committee, because I think in some respects some of the old misconceptions still do remain, and we've done a bit of research around this to really try and get under the skin of it a bit. And I think what's been interesting about COVID, in a way, it has shone a bit of a light on our sector, because it's quite invisible until it stops working, and then actually if you realise the extent to which it is the glue that kind of makes the wheels go round when there's shortages of products on shelves and people can't get things, and that's what logistics is. And when you explain it to people that it's what gets the delivery to your doorstep, when you explain it in those terms, people begin to understand a bit more about what it is, and then you can sort of start to tackle some of the misconceptions. Sustainability is one. Yes, HGV is the main way of getting goods around, but it's not industrial buildings that create that. It's consumption, and that's not going to go away. In a growing economy, that will just increase, but going forward. So it's really a question of what are the solutions to that? How do we do that in the most sustainable way possible? And one of the good things about, say, e-commerce is one, it lends itself to vans. So electrification is pretty much here for vans. You're going to see a big change in the next few years around that. And actually, one e-commerce delivery doing around 50 people with a clever bit of software that makes it the most efficient route possible to get around all those people is more sustainable, takes miles off the road relative to those 50 people going individually to pick something up from the shops. And that's not commonly always understood. And that's part of the sort of messaging in the right way. So, as far as we can get help and support in getting some of that messaging out there, it's appreciated. And just, in terms of that, completely appreciate the difficulty in London with such high housing targets and demand competing, for space. And, we really do need a strategic vision for industrial. Some of it can sit alongside potentially residential, but we perhaps have to be much more granular in the way we consider the asset class. There's some people who need 24/7 access that it's never going to work for, but maybe there's some other types of occupier that could sit close to residential. And then I think, as Colin suggested, we might need some limited release of greenbelt, which would be the sites that would be really strategic next to key transport nodes that could handle high volumes of traffic, where we might look at multi-storey development. And if we can accommodate industrial there, does that free up some industrial somewhere else that might actually be a better place for residential development because of the existing transport and it's close to a town centre? So, I think we need some big thinking about that, and that there is no doubt very tough decisions to be made.
Yeah, lots of interesting food for thought for Chris and Duncan there potentially. And I think on coming to some of the audience questions that we've had coming in, one of them is slightly controversial about the carbon neutral the agenda, and I guess it does point out some of the potential negative perceptions of the transport infrastructure around industrial and logistics sites. But an anonymous attendee has asked, how does Merton's ambition for carbon neutral relate to the promotion and expansion of facilities for companies like Campana, Rest and Waste, and UV Recycling, who have got lots of HEVs coming in and out of residential areas around Plough Lane and Danceford Road? So a very specific question. I presume that's one for Chris. Have you got any thoughts or views on that point?
Yeah, very briefly. I suppose the first point is our ambition is to be a zero carbon borough by 2050, and things aren't going to change overnight. It's slow, steady progress to that. And the other principle that we need to recognise is that we need to, as a city and as a borough, we need to consume our own smoke. And we do have development going on in the borough, particularly around Plough Lane with the AFC Wimbledon Stadium and 600 homes. It is not surprising that there is a significant amount of movement. And we do have some waste transfer stations in that vicinity to which some of that waste is going. But we need to work locally and nationally on policies which work much more towards a circular economy, so that waste isn't a word that we use anymore in our language, that buildings that we've previously had are used more constructively for the future, they're readapted and repurposed, but also that what we're putting up in the future is something that's going to last and can be adapted and flexed as necessary. But when it reaches the end of its life, it can be repurposed, taken down and reutilised in its component parts. We're not going to get that overnight. And I think it is unfortunate that people are inconvenienced when a city is changing. But we need to work consistent with national planning policies locally. And those need to develop and flex as we go forward, so that we can have the best possible policies to ensure that we can live a more sustainable life. And we have that circular economy built into our policies and procedures.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's a really good answer. And obviously it is just a matter of competing priorities for lots of people in this area. So yeah, definitely. Hopefully that answered the question for our anonymous attendee. I wanted to pick up on another one, which is about planning. So potentially one for Duncan, which is about the planning policy. The planning is being modernised quickly, and at the moment there's a focus in policy of protecting industrial areas and delivering jobs, how can planning better embrace the changes and growth you're describing? So I guess something about not specifically your team, but is there anything from a borough point of view in terms of the planning process that you think there are being improvements made, or any changes you think that could help with that?
Yes, I mean, I think at the moment we're in a sort of unique place, and Chris probably agree, where there is some, obviously there's the government white paper on planning that's come through, and that sort of gives quite a challenge to local communities and our local plan making, and how we understand that and adapt it to our locality, because it's become obviously a lot more generic and permissive, and that sounds like a good thing sometimes, but actually in my opinion we still need to manage our built environment, and the exact things we're talking about today about protecting and managing and growing all need to be done at a local borough level, but also regional and then London level. So I think obviously London has quite a specific plan through the London plan, and it does protect employment and industrial land in a very strong way, and we do reflect that in the borough. But I think going forwards, I think it will be still in the community's gift to shape its own environment. I think the more specific you are locally, I think, and particularly around these areas, I feel that will continue to take hold in our communities as we debate and engage with our residents around what the best land uses are. But going back to Chris's point around the green sustainability agenda, that has to be in everything we do, and that circular economy. So we all have to meet that challenge. But I think, as I say, we have to see how the government white paper evolves. We are feeding into that with our sort of our neighbouring boroughs, because I don't subscribe to a very permissive planning environment. I think we need management, we need control, and often the planning system gets knocked for that, and it's seen as obstructive. But actually, in many ways, I feel the current system is quite permissive, and we can do these things, but just in a more organised way. So I think, that's sort of a long answer, but I think there's nothing in the plans that prevents that. Kingston is on its own journey at the moment, sort of at the beginning of the planning process for its local plans. So we will take that into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, definitely given the jobs points that we've talked about and the importance of the sector and the growth of the sector, it's good to hear that that's all being focused on. We are coming towards the end of the session, but I'm going to try and include a couple of the other audience questions in our sort of final remarks and comments. Rob Witt has asked a question about electric vans and the timescales on those, and another attendee has also asked a question about other sectors that might have benefited from, I don't know, the lockdown situation. You mentioned the retail sector, but are there opportunities that have opened up in other sectors too? So I guess our sort of final question to each of you would be about the future. Do you see South West London continue to grow and scale up in this area, and ideally picking up on potential sector growth that you might see coming forward, and the potential opportunities and challenges for this as a sort of closing remark? And Ollie, if you could pick up on the electric vans point, that would be brilliant, please. So I'll come to Colin first for your sort of final remarks on next steps for industrial and logistics in South West London.
Yeah, I think for me, South West London certainly has a lot of USPs, and certainly the conversations that we've been having with Duncan recently have all been focused on really trying to emphasise those USPs to external areas, external businesses, and try to draw those businesses into the region. So I think for me that's a major focus going forward. I think we're very lucky with South West London that it does have the diversification of businesses, the transport connections, the real estate opportunities that it does have, and ultimately that it is a location where people do want to live, work and play. So I think let's maximise the benefit off of that. I think just on the sustainability point, absolutely, electric vans are already here. We're the work that we're trying to do as part of our modernisation of our available estates is all about trying to include more EV facilities, so that any businesses that are operating electric vehicles, whether that's cars or vans, have charging facilities to be able to get them back up and running again. So from our perspective, that is a big focus, and no doubt it is on the development side as well.
Great, thank you, Colin. Ollie, I'll come to you next for your closing remarks.
Yeah, so on the vans, yeah, Colin's right. They're here, and there are some very major names in the sort of e-commerce world that have very concrete plans to have a complete shift towards electric vehicles over the next 5 years. I mean, there's some inadvertent consequences. I mentioned some of the policy things and understanding our sector, but in order for them to do that, actually they need somewhere to store and hold the vans, and that means some sites that is purely for van storage, which is in contravention of specific policies around development densities and the like. But it is necessary to create an electric sustainable fleet at this point in time, when personal ownership of electric vehicles is not common, and so there's been some challenges in doing that, and again, it's really helping, trying to take a big picture and helping kind of policymakers and decision makers understand the big picture.
Great, thank you. Robert, your views on the growth of the sector in the southwest and what more will happen? What's going to happen next?
As I said at the beginning, I think the two go hand in hand. The increase in the residential is going to do nothing but add and increase the pressure for the last mile logistics sector. As Ollie and Colin have already said, we have got we've got the electric vehicles. They're here. We don't always see them on the road, but they're certainly there, and the 3PLs are certainly looking at it. I see it as a sector that probably in its infancy still. It's in the first third probably. We've got another 2/3 of growth in this sector to go. So, yeah, I think it's positive for the southwest.
Yeah, brilliant. And I like the point about residential being a supporting factor for industrial and logistics rather than a sort of potential obstruction or competing priority. So it's a nice optimistic way to look at it. Chris, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be brief, because we certainly want to work very closely with this sector to drive the growth and in particular the job density, but also how this sector supports the development of sustainable communities. The 15-minute city, people shopping and using local facilities much more. That's not to denigrate the logistics sector, which will be absolutely vital in all of our lives going forward. But we need to think about that local infrastructure that supports people to live sustainable lives. A couple of points. Really encouraged by the conversations around electric vehicles. We'll need to think locally and sub-regionally about the energy infrastructure to support that and how much of that we can generate locally. And then on housing, we will have a larger population. We will need to work closely with this sector about how we can keep those two, both the housing growth and the industrial growth, working side by side, and how we can work imaginatively in developing new approaches to that. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thank you. And Duncan?
Yep, I'll be brief. No, I'm encouraged by the future, and I think it's been really positive in terms of hearing all the views today around the growing sector. And I think what COVID has done has really brought us all together around what we need to do and where we need to focus our energy and our efforts. And I think that's certainly for me today. I've got some good takeaways, and I'll be taking those back to colleagues across the council around how we shape our policy accordingly and we engage more in partnership. And I think that's the key thing, is partnership and the opportunity. We need to focus on those two things, and I think the southwest particularly will be all right. So let's see how we go.
Good positive end note, and yeah, really good to hear that it's been a useful session in terms of having some thoughts and ideas for the future. Obviously, as representative of Real Estate Live, being the only panel that's run over time isn't great. But sorry to the audience that we've run 4 minutes over time. But I do want to say thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. It's been a really good session. I think brought out some of the really important points, but also obviously showcased the growth opportunities for this sector in South West London, and I guess across London more broadly, but particularly highlighting some of the key features that are going to help this sector: the talent pool in South West London, the green and palatial areas, and the strong residential population. So yeah, it's been a really good discussion to have, and I think important to start talking the sector up more at more of these events. It's an important one for everyone, and particularly in the current times. So thank you to Aviva Investors and Colin for bringing this session together. Next up in the Real Estate Live programme, we have a session brought to you by London and Partners and New London Architecture, which is actually about the road towards net zero. So picking up on some of the themes that we've been talking about today, that's happening later on, and you can find the link to join that on the Real Estate Live website. And hopefully we'll see the audience again at another session later this week. And thank you again to our panel for taking part. See you all soon.